Okay, we're not going to segue through European history. That's what you get in a world history class. But for our purposes, basically, again, as I sort of finished up last time, you have to visualize that, especially World War II, basically destroys almost all of Europe. I mean, Spain's sort of out of it, but they had a civil war. Basically, all the rest of Europe is just sort of wiped. By the end of World War II, because you have to remember, World War II is only about 30 years after World War I, and so the death toll between the two wars meant that most European countries, there's no one between the ages of, say, 15 and 40 or 15 and 50 years old. They're all dead on the battlefield somewhere. So not only the countries literally just leveled, in the sense that there's almost nothing standing for most of these countries, but their populations are almost non-existent. So basically, the Europeans pretty much do a really good job of trying to collectively kill themselves off. So World War II ends 1945. Basically everything from Poland west to sort of doesn't exist. It's all stirred up. Everyone's all over the place. The war was largely based, at least one of the basic premises was the idea of Aryan race, which of course was the Nazi Party slogan, with the idea that this ethnicity, that the folks that were in this case spun as sort of white, blonde, blue hair, blue-eyed, German-speaking folks were all actually different and better than everyone else. So therefore, you should either get rid or genocide everyone who isn't, which was, of course, the whole Nazi logic. But it wasn't unique to Germany. The Nazi Party movement not only had actually starts in Sweden, but not only that, but all the other countries had their same attitudes. They weren't as explicit about it. But the French, the British, and everyone were very intolerant of anyone who wasn't exactly part of their group. And if you still look at British history even today, as it's in world history classes, they very much talk about the Anglo-Saxons coming in, and sort of the whole Picts and the actual English that existed prior to that. They just sort of get the tar beat out of them, and they just sort of disappear from history. And so the Vikings and the Anglos, the Angles coming in, the Aryans coming in, are seen as the builders of the United Kingdom, which is one reason why the Scots and the Irish sort of won out most of the time, and the Welsh too. They're not part of that group. So what you get is, the complexities of Europe, and this idea of ethnic identity basically defines the in-group and the out-group, leads to a place that very happily tries to kill themselves off for, basically half a century. And all this ends in 1945. One, there's not a lot of Europeans left. And two, there's sort of at least at that moment in time, I think this just appears real quick, but for a moment in time, people are sort of going, this whole idea of ethnic identity being the litmus test for, being a person is really stupid, because they're just looking around and all of a sudden their relatives, their friends, their neighbors don't exist anymore. Their house, their neighborhood, their city's just gone. And they're sort of thinking this wasn't worth it. So they sort of the internal sort of, collective, not soul searching, but sort of this collective identity thing is sort of like, damn, this was probably a bad idea. In that context, they then look around, and when all the dust has settled post World War II, what you end up with is Russia on one hand had got its clock clean too, but a large part of the industrial base of Russia was still intact. North America hadn't been touched, and South America hadn't been touched. Most of Africa hadn't been touched. So there's whole parts of the country, whole parts of the world which had not really been engaged in the conflict that was World War II directly, in the sense of places destroyed, etc. And so after World War II, what happens, especially in the case of the United States, is this massive industrial base, which of course had actually been amplified by the war, just keeps on going. And it quits building tanks and it starts building cars and trucks, for example, among other things. And so what very quickly happens is all these countries in Europe, which in the scale actually shows up pretty well, because you have to remember a lot of these countries are no larger than American states. So all of a sudden they realize that world dominance that they'd had from, say, 1700 to 1900, they have just erased it. They've through self-inflicted wounds, they've just gotten rid of their empires. They're no longer in control of the rest of the planet. And to be honest, for the rest of the planet, they're pretty marginal. The rest of the planet is not particularly impressed that they almost, they literally started a global war. And pretty much tried to destroy the planet if they could get away with it. And it didn't happen, but it wasn't through any fault of theirs. And so when World War II is finished, everyone's sort of looking at the Europeans saying, well, that was, good on you. Their empires are gone. The countries are destroyed in large part economically. And so what happens, of course, then they immediately start to try to rebuild the way they were. So the French decide they're going to do the French things and the Germans do their German things. And the French have car companies like Peugeot and Renault and places like that. The Germans have their BMW and their Audi and their Porsche and stuff like that. And they're building their cars just as an example. And they realize that they cannot compete with the production capabilities in North America. And so very quickly, General Motors, Ford, all these guys move into Europe, and pretty quickly, almost a huge proportion of the cars being sold in Europe are American cars. They might have been built in factories in Europe, but in large part they're American design and American, packaged in an American profit automobiles. And so in the automobile industry, as in almost every other area, the Europeans realized that because of the wars and because of the infrastructure loss and the population loss, they're no longer competitive in the world market. And in fact, prior to that, they probably hadn't been competitive, except they had these global empires that sort of made them artificially competitive. So if you were the United Kingdom, if you were England, you weren't actually competitive because of what was in England. You were competitive because you controlled a large chunk of the planet, and all those resources belonged to you. You paid almost nothing for them. World War II ends, and that's suddenly gone, and all of a sudden you're just left with who you actually are. And so sort of this illusion of colonialism, when it disappears, leaves the Europeans looking pretty pitiful. And so the end result of this is by the 1950s, they're not competitive. The quality control is not there. European automobiles were famous for parts slowly falling off if you looked at them sideways. I know, I used to own British cars all the time, and French ones too. And so basically they couldn't compete. They couldn't make good toasters. They couldn't make good coffee makers. They couldn't do anything right. And so this world dominance, pretty much they find themselves sort of like in the third tier of goofy places. And the big players for various political and social reasons end up being the USSR, the Soviet Union, now Russia largely, and of course the United States. And in that context, the Europeans very quickly realized that they're just becoming a market. People make stuff in every part of the planet, but the Europeans are not able to keep up because the French are competing not only with the Americans and the Russians, but the French are also competing with the Germans and the Brits and the Spanish and the Italians, et cetera, et cetera. So their sort of uniqueness that they were so proud of in the 19th and 20th century till 1945 now works against them because they don't have a large enough mass to be competitive globally if you're just talking about France. And even more importantly, in the 20th, 21st century, they don't have enough resources because they don't have a colonial empire anymore. Now, if they want iron, they have to buy it from Australia or the United States or Canada, just like everyone else. And so all these unique aspects that made Europe so successful right into, say, the 20th century, in large part, in some ways, actually worked against them by the end of the 20th century. And the end result is it's either they realize that either they're just going to go bankrupt one country after another, or the alternative is to swallow this sort of ethnic nation state logic and supplant it with a collective. And so what you find is it starts initially militarily with NATO and Warsaw Pact for Russia. But what happens is you realize that the strength you have as a collective is more than you have as individuals. Now, the trick is what you have to do is you have to give up some of that individualism to be part of the collective. It's the same as being a part of a team. If you're part of I play rugby, but if you're part of a rugby or soccer team, you can't do what you want to. You have to do what the particular play is they're trying to do to get the ball down to the other side. So you have to work as a team, as a group. And so what happens is Europe decides they have to do that. So they start with the European Common Market in the 1950s, with the idea that if you're growing wine in France and you want to sell it in Germany, prior to this, the minute it crossed the German border, you had to pay a hell of a lot of money because the Germans wanted to protect German wine makers. And so they punished the French ones by taxing them right through the eyeballs. And so the Europeans realized they're basically killing each other. And so what they do is they sort of collectively decide, the countries in the West sort of collectively decide what they're going to do is they're going to form a common market. And they're going to get rid of all those nasty little tariffs. You can't, you're different than me. So they're going to say, no, you guys got to grow up. So that becomes the ECM. By the 1970s, that's not only been successful. Now Europeans can actually do stuff and become a collective. They realize that works. So what they do is they form the European Union, which is what they've got now. So basically, originally, I believe 11 or 16, I don't know, the book's got it, and whatever countries form the European Union are designed to basically be an economic counterpart, if you would, to the United States, and on one hand, and sort of like Russia on the other. And to a certain extent, then also the Japanese, Korean, and later Chinese markets in Asia. And it works really well initially. The problem they get into is they get into this attitude, well, this works so well, we're going to expand this. So, if you've been to Europe, you travel through Europe, you don't need a visa to get from one country to another. You take the TGV, for example, in Paris, and you can go to Germany, you can go down to Italy, Austria, wherever. And it's just like going from Alabama to Tennessee. You're just, there's nothing. As you go through, there's different signage, but they all use the euro, so they use the same currency system. There's a European passport. So, it basically becomes like a set of states in the United States. And everyone's going, wow, this is really sort of convenient. They sort of liked it. The problem is they never actually got into serious discussions about the idea of ethnic identity and the nation state. So in a weird way, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, all these countries that are part of the EU still have national governments. Merkel's now getting ready to retire as the prime minister of Germany. Mitterrand, I believe, is no, I forget who the prime minister of France is right now. The goofy guy is the prime minister of the UK. So you've got these guys and they're prime ministers in their own country. So they still got their own country. They got their national parliament. People vote for national elections. So they're their own country and they're part of this collective, which is supposed to have a common now constitution. It has a common parliament in The Hague in the Netherlands. And yet on the other hand, they're still countries. So they don't give up the nation state. They sort of think that they're going to lay this layer on top of it of a collective. And it's going to make people less of a nation state. In my view, what you get is sort of like, have you ever seen like an all-star team? They're oftentimes really crappy because they're not a team that plays together, just a bunch of all-stars cherry-picked from other groups. And they're sort of stuck and, all of a sudden they're playing on an all-star basketball team, but they've never played together. They're all superstars. They all think they're really hot shit. So they're not going to work well as a team generally because it's all, they've sort of got a bad attack of me, me, me. There's no sense of identity of the collective. Problem with the EU is it sort of ended up being the same thing. It worked well for some things. Airbus, for example, becomes one of the big global airplane manufacturing concerns in the world, but they end up in this weird situation. They make the engines, I think they make the engines in Germany. They then fly them by airplane down to France where they make the fuselages, the middle part of the plane, and they make the other parts somewhere else. It's like flying this crap all over the place to put it together. It's very inefficient. But because all the European countries sort of engage and agree, among other things, to buy Airbus planes, they can actually make a plane that's not particularly efficient, and they can get away with it because now they've got enough, if you would, energy going, and enough cash going to actually make it a competitive thing, sort of. This works well as long as you don't really push it too hard. But especially with, ironically, refugees moving in largely from the West Asia, we usually call the Middle East, and other areas, what you get is one, the number of people who are not from those particular ethnic groups that want to move into the EU increases. The EU, for a bunch of complicated reasons, some of which tied to World War II, generally allows immigrants in with very little sort of control over them. But some of the countries don't want that because their sense of nationhood is tied to a particular look and a particular ethnicity, and these new populations don't fit. That's some of those videos you're watching. What they also do is, because they see this market thing as being useful, is some of the countries, Germany especially, pushed to add new countries constantly to the EU. So by the late 1990s, a lot of these countries you see here are now part of the European Union, which was not part of the original structure, which is pretty much what you might traditionally call Western Europe. And so what happens is a bunch of countries that are very, very diverse, not only in terms of their background, their history, they don't have even a shared history even of World War II in some ways. They have entirely different economic systems. They've got entirely different political systems. And all of a sudden they're now part of this package. But the buy-in was really pretty cheap. And there's not really a lot of collective shared agreement on anything. Pretty much the whole system is run by France and Germany. And they pretty much dictate what everyone else is going to do. So obviously they like the EU because they do really well out of it. If you're Croatia, Austria, or something like that, you ain't that thrilled necessarily. Now, the other thing that occurs, of course, in the 2005-2008 period is the huge economic collapse, which hit Europe incredibly badly, especially Southern Europe. Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and basically all go bankrupt in the space of less than a year. And so other parts of the EU have to start giving them money to keep them afloat. Now, if the EU were a real collective, that's okay. Your neighbor's part of your neighborhood. You got to help your neighbor out. That's okay. But the reality is, of course, is Germany's a country. And so their folks don't want to be taxed to pay for Italian bad decisions or Greek bad choices as they see it. And the Italians get all pissed off because the Germans are giving them a lot of attitude. When on the other hand, they might want something the Italians and just, oh, you're part of the, you're supposed to do this. So this thing was very fragile. It really wasn't holding together very well. The British finally decided they'd had enough of it. So I think about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the British decided, the United Kingdom decided, this is not working. We're losing our national identity, we're losing control. We don't think the EU is worth it. And they basically eventually back out, which is still a fiasco they're dealing with now. So the United Kingdom's not part of the EU now. And all of a sudden, a bunch of the other countries start to look at the EU and start to think, what's in it for us versus the cost that's inherent in being a collective. So what's happening is nation state is growing. Nationhood in that sense of ethnic identity is becoming ever more powerful. The new prime minister coming in Germany is much more of an ethnic nationalist than Merkel was, who was pretty pragmatic. And so what you have through Europe, is a lot of the folks coming to power are ethnic specialists. In other words, the Austrian prime minister is a classic case of when the guys are working hard, and he's totally Austrian, screw the rest of the world. So in that context, all of a sudden the EU is very fragile. Now, on top of that, given this is January 22, you now got Russia over here getting ready to invade the Ukraine and probably will within the next week or two. And even though the Ukraine's not part of the EU, they have close economic ties with the European Union. And the eastern part of the EU is deathly afraid that this will spill over into them, either directly in warfare or in terms of refugees or whatever. And so they want the EU to do something. But if you're France or Spain or Netherlands or something like that, you're saying like, hell, I don't want to start World War III over these guys over here. So the problem with the EU is it never really clearly defined what it was. There really wasn't a lot of buy-in in terms, people liked the superficial part of it, but they never really thought through the consequences of it. And it's really starting to unravel spectacularly in late 2021 and COVID just pushed this along but didn't make it happen, and early 22. And we'll see this in a bunch of sort of interesting ways it's played out. But the European Union is what Europe thought it had become post-World War II, especially by the 1970s. And it's now started to sort of either unthink or rethink just exactly what that all means. And this is going to play out with enormous consequences globally. Because the EU, of course, is also in one way, shape, or form, as NATO is one of the huge military organizations on the planet. And they operate, again, as a collective, theoretically, but it's still a German army, a French army, a British army, a Belgian army, whatever. And so how that plays out, given what looks like to be warfare starting on the eastern part of this, is going to be really problematic when all of a sudden national or ethnic national interest comes to play over collective interest, which sounds a lot like 1939 again, but I'm hoping I'm wrong there.